This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, May 15th, 2026. The Liberal government is signaling plans to significantly expand the newly created Defense Investment Agency, giving it broader authority to move away from standard military procurement processes and take on a wider role that could extend onto other areas of the economy. These plans are outlined in a Ways and Means motion tabled in the House of Commons, which serves as a precursor to formal legislation expected at a later date. The Defense Investment Agency Act, introduced in May 2026 as part of Budget 2025 Implementation Act No. 2, establishes the Defense Investment Agency as a standalone entity to accelerate military procurement. It amends the Defense Production Act to expand its scope, granting the new agency, led by a dedicated minister and CEO, broader powers to streamline purchasing, support domestic industry, and enhance national security. If the federal government wants to suspend the normal procurement process, there are currently 4 exceptions under existing legislation that allow that. When passed, the new legislation will allow 14 exceptions. Here today to help analyze these developments, we're lucky to be joined by Jody Thomas, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, and former Deputy Minister of Defense. We'll also be joined by Philippe Lagassé, Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and former ADM Matt in the Department of National Defense, Troy Crosby. This is the Expert Series. We'll start off today's episode with a conversation we had with Jody Thomas earlier this week, before turning to Philippe Lagassé and closing out the episode with Troy Crosby. Jody, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm wondering if you might just be able to unpack some of the practical impacts of giving the Defense Investment Agency broader authority, as well as maybe some of the impacts of updating the Defense Production Act on how Canada procures military equipment. And maybe a third pillar of that, if you could maybe explain how the two are connected as well.
So it's a very broad question. I think the impact of the creation of the DIA, giving it a standalone minister, and the amendments to the Defense Production Act will come together to allow for faster, more targeted procurement for the Canadian Armed Forces. It will, I think it will reduce the silos. Now, the devil will be in the details for sure, but it allows for one minister to be accountable. It ensures that there is a dedicated professional staff where this is their sole job, procurement of goods for the Canadian Armed Forces and, I presume, the Canadian Coast Guard. So there will be career paths and staff development in a way that was more difficult when 4 departments were involved. And it ensures, I hope, that there will be a firm consideration of value for money of what's being purchased for the armed forces. And so in totality, I think it's all good, but the devil will be in the details about who is accountable for what processes will be, and how budgets are managed and who has accountability for those budgets.
If we are giving a defined minister a lot more power and sway over these kinds of decisions, how can we ensure that there's still transparency, and how can we add, I guess, the necessary safeguards to ensure that those decisions are sound and fair?
So when I was at Defense, a decision was made that the Defense Investment Plan would be made public, and it would be updated every year and then refreshed. I think it was every 3. I think that has to continue. With the amount of money that's being spent comes great responsibility. And so transparency is absolutely going to be necessary. And I think in the elaboration of that investment plan, there has to be an analysis of what can be sole sourced, what has to go to competition, what must be, by definition, a Canadian purchase, a buy-only Canadian plan. Drones, for example. We should not be buying drones offshore. All drones should be bought and manufactured in Canada. And that investment plan, I think, Well, it will require a lot of work, should start to define and elaborate and make transparent to both Canadians, to politicians, and to the defense industry where they should pay attention, where a decision has already been made, and where there has to be an RFP and what that RFP could look like.
Thanks, Jody. I'm hoping we can actually back up a moment here. Practitioners, people in the policy world, people from CAP and D&D listen to this podcast, but we also have a general and lay audience listening as well. I'm wondering if you might be able to first kind of explain specifically, quickly, the role of the deputy minister in all of this, and maybe you could reflect on your time as deputy minister and explain to us maybe what you saw as the greatest points of friction when it came to the procurement system.
So the role of the deputy minister, as defined in the National Defence Act and in the Accountability Act and the Financial Administration Act, is this senior public servant responsible for budget, process, administration, and procurement in the Department of National Defence. The Department of National Defence is unique in the Government of Canada in that it's a duality. The Chief of the Defence Staff and the Deputy Minister both report to the Minister, both are equal deputy heads, and that is unique. There is no other department that has that structure. In my time at Defence, in terms of procurement, there are a couple of things I observed. So I'll speak very broadly here as we talk about the department. One, yes, the deputy minister is responsible for procurement oversight and ensuring budgets are met and requirements, et cetera, that the entire structure of procurement functions. And the responsibility for that was delegated mostly to ADM Matt. My observation is that the environmental commanders were not as involved in that process as perhaps they needed to be. And I think there's an opportunity for a reset there. You know, the commander of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Special Forces, although Special Forces was a little different, and now there are additional commands, need to be involved in what's being procured for their branches. I think it's one of the most singular responsibilities of the environmental commanders. And so that was something I pushed for while I was at Defense. I think the major point of friction was, it was called a three-legged stool between Defense, PSPC, and ISED. And I actually didn't say, and sometimes GAC was in there depending on countries we were either selling to or buying from, and the reasons why we were buying from a particular country. So GAC had a say in it, and of course Treasury Board and Finance and PCO, but the three-legged stool was the three major departments. And I often felt that it wasn't a balanced stool. ITBs, industrial technical benefits, actually should not be driving procurement and should not be an equal weight to capacity and requirements and budget. Requirements and budget should drive the process, and requirements first and foremost. What do we need? How's it going to serve the armed forces, and how does it meet the need? Has to drive the entire process. And so I found I said to be the biggest point of friction, not the individuals, just the program responsibility that they had. And I often found that when government felt something went wrong in process somewhere, they piled more onto defense procurement. There was the problem with Boeing and its challenge to Bombardier. They added a Boeing clause to defense procurement, even though it was a civilian purchase and had nothing to do with the Department of Defense and things we were trying to do. And so in reaction to perceived issues, more process was piled on defense all the time. And I found that to be very problematic. We became the easy target. And that really did cause us. It just added process. It slowed us down. It made it difficult to achieve what needed to be achieved.
Now, Jody, oftentimes our procurement system has been accused of being slow, overly cautious due to some of the myriad reasons you've just discussed. And you did mention earlier that you seem to be optimistic about some of these changes. How far do you think they'll be able to go in addressing some of these more cultural elements, or do you think the legislation that's been proposed in the DIA are good steps forward towards maybe breaking down this culture of caution?
So I think the proposals are good steps forward. Again, as I've said, the devil will be in the details. When we have had to do things quickly in the past, during Afghanistan, the buying additional globe masters as an example, other things that have been sole sourced, the town knows how to do it, and the system ramps up really quickly, and we're able to achieve the effect desired. Um, but the rest of the time, when there isn't intent from the government to sole source, to do something quickly and surgically, the risk aversion creeps in. And it's because of Auditor General reports, it's because of PVO criticism, it's because of opposition criticism, it's because of the politicization of the process that not only slows us, in some cases has caused procurements to be stopped and have to be restarted, and years and years and years are lost. And those are years where the armed forces is unable to defend the country and do the jobs we ask of them. And so the consequences are huge when a procurement is stopped and restarted. So the risk aversion comes from long history of mistakes being penalized severely. And so hopefully the intent of the government to do things faster, to make decisions about how we're going to procure in this new environment will remove some of that risk aversion. And we will accept that mistakes are going to get made. And what we do is, correct the mistake. We redirect as opposed to starting over. And so I think there's an opportunity here, but risk tolerance is going to matter enormously in it.
Jody, I think it might be argued that under the current Carney government, this current iteration of the Liberal government, we've seen a lot of advances on the defense file, announcements that we've reached 2% and are now aiming for 3.5 and 5%. And in lockstep with our NATO allies, we've seen many announcements over the past few months, the Defense Industrial Strategy, the agency which we're speaking about. What do you think are some of the primary factors influencing this, maybe one could call, some of these rapid developments? And do you see how difficult might it be to sustain this momentum over the more medium to longer term?
On the number one influence, of course, is geopolitics. The world is as unstable as it's been since, the end of World War II. A sense that Canada has to stand on its own 2 feet, that we are, as it stands, unable to defend this country, and that we have a responsibility as a sovereign nation to defend our own country. That the United States we once knew is perhaps changed. And while I don't think they are a kinetic threat to us, they're certainly not always our partner in the way we would have normally and historically expected them to be. And a sense that there's a pay to play in the clubs we want to be a part of, and we haven't paid. And so it is time. Sustaining it is going to be difficult, especially as we start to look at 3.5 and 5%, because those numbers are staggering. We're a country with a high GDP and a low population, and we are an expensive country to run. And so it's going to take really very dedicated political determination and tenacity to keep this momentum going, working hand in hand with the public service who will be delivering for them. It gets difficult when people don't have doctors and can't buy houses and social programs are affected. But other countries do it, and Canada is going to have to.
Wondering if I can ask you a hypothetical here. Let's say you were still in government as the deputy minister. How might this introduction of the Defense Investment Agency and the new minister impact your day-to-day and your involvement in these projects as the DM?
Well, it might make it easier, and certainly different, because I, was accountable for all the major procurement, and now there will be a head of an agency in Doug Guzman, who is accountable for that. I think the working relationship between the Deputy Minister of National Defense And the CEO of the Defense Investment Agency is going to have to, by necessity, be a very close one. Requirements, for example, I think absolutely have to stay in the Department of National Defense. It is the military who has to describe and define what they need to buy. And so that must stay with those environmental commanders. Where the budget sits, probably in DIA because they're executing, but budgets will be defined with DIA in defense and with the military as we look to what needs to be purchased. There will be a sharing of people and process, no doubt. And I think that there is an opportunity here to really rationalize, and that doesn't mean reduce, who does what, and the kinds of skill sets we need in our procurement and policy analysis, public servants on the procurement, the major procurement side of things. I think there's an opportunity here to revamp and change and really modernize how it's done. I think that this has to be seen as an opportunity. And if I were the Deputy Minister of Defense, I would be working hard with the head of DIA to make sure that it works for both of us. And I have absolutely no doubt that Chris Fox is doing just that.
Jody, were you advising the government perhaps on implementation? What is maybe one element of the current procurement or requirements definition process we have that you would be perhaps cautious about disrupting? So I guess in other words, maybe what's working right now that maybe we should maintain?
So I think the IRPDA, that requirements review process, actually provides a lot of value. And it was imposed after the F-35 to make sure that we didn't target sole source pieces of equipment and say that was the only thing on the market that could be bought. It was maybe an overreaction, but I actually found it really useful as the deputy minister in terms of helping me understand what the requirements were and why, and whether the requirements actually answered the question, were broad enough, were inclusive enough of what was available on the market, and answered the question of what we expected this piece of equipment to do. And so I would keep the IRPDA and I would keep it in defense with requirements. And when that piece is finished, I think that's possibly when it moves to DIA. And so what would be really important is that segmentation of who does what and when things move back and forth between the two, the department and the agency.
Jody Thomas, thanks so much for joining us today, providing your expertise on this subject of the DIA and the changes in the Defense Production Act. Before we wrap up, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts on anything we've discussed today. Maybe for an audience tuning in who is just learning about some of these defense subjects, I'm wondering if you might be able to underscore the significance maybe as well for them.
So what we ask our Canadian Armed Forces, the men and women in the Canadian Armed Forces, to do means that we have to ensure they have the equipment they need to do it for us. And in 2026, it is critical that Canadians start understanding we have to be able to defend ourselves. This process and the amount of money, this new agency and the amount of money that's going to be spent by it for the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces is a really important part of who we are as Canadians going forward. And so I think it's worth paying attention to. I think it's worth asking questions about. I think it needs to be transparent, but it is money well spent for defining who we are as a country.
What do you find most notable about the proposed legislation?
The most interesting aspects for me were first just how many powers are being given to the minister and to the CEO of the DIA to invest significantly in the Canadian Defence Industrial Base and to acquire from Canadian companies. And therefore, this is in keeping with the government's defense industrial strategy. As well, I found it was notable to see just how many exceptions are placed in legislation to allow the minister to move ahead without a competitive procurement process. So those were the two really notable ones that I saw.
So The DIA was originally part of Public Services and Procurement Canada before being elevated as a standalone department in the spring economic update. For decades, buying military equipment has been split between D&D and a separate procurement department. So now these amendments create, as you mentioned, a standalone Minister for Defense Procurement and a new Defense Investment Agency. Could you maybe discuss some of the potential implications of centralizing all that power into one specialized office instead of keeping the traditional system?
So what I think we're seeing here is elements of what would have been at ISED to some extent, elements of what would have been at D&D CAF, and certainly and most prominently authorities and powers that would have belonged to Public Services and Procurement Canada. And as well, if I'm reading the legislation correctly in here, it's a bit vague, so I'm not entirely confident in this, but it looks like contracting authority that is normally delegated by Treasury Board to Public Services and Procurement Canada for defense procurement. It looks like this new minister is actually being given contracting authority that would normally belong to the board, at least upwards of for contracts of $1 billion. Now, above $1 billion, it looks like the Treasury Board still retains that authority, including expenditure authority, but I get the sense that there's something moving here as well. Now, what is less evident to me is where D&D CAF's responsibilities for defense procurement end and where the DIA's kick in. And I think this is still a major point of tension that the legislation doesn't quite address yet. Namely, does the DIA or will the DIA be involved in any way, shape, or form in the requirements setting process that the CAF undertakes? And if not, could we see potential points of tension occurring now?
Do we know what other new powers the proposed Defense and National Security Production and Procurement Act could give the minister responsible for the agency?
There's a number of things. I mean, again, quite a few of the authorities that already exist for things like urgent operational requirements are being transferred to this minister, being able to contract for sensitive technology, being able to contract for economic security. I mean, there's a whole panoply of authorities that are going along with being able to invest not only in defense procurement, but also national security, including economic security. So the potential remit of the minister is fairly large. And again, I think the aspect that was most striking to me is the potential of being able to effectively, as far as I can tell, avoid competitive processes in almost any case that, and this is quoted from the legislation, in the minister's opinion's an interesting word here, in the minister's opinion, any exceptions that would apply. So you could potentially use this to greatly accelerate defense procurement and national security procurements, in fact, in a number of different areas.
If a single minister can decide when to bypass perhaps competitive procurement, what safeguards do you think might need to be there to prevent misuse or potentially poor decision making, or rather, what kind of safeguards generally need to be in place?
Well, I think this will be where it gets interesting in terms of whether or not the Treasury Board's delegation is as the legislation seems to indicate that it is. Namely, is there a significant transfer of contracting authority? And if not, then the Treasury Board might still have an oversight, particularly of larger contracts, and that's the same with the expenditure authority. As well, we shouldn't forget that there may be some decisions that are brought up to full cabinet that are considered controversial enough or politically sensitive enough. And as well, I would anticipate that the defense minister and other ministers who have a stake in this will still want to have their say in some way. Now, all that said, it does give this new minister a significant amount of, and by extension, the chief executive officer of the DIA, a significant amount of authority. But we can't have it both ways. If we say that we want defense procurement to really accelerate, and we say that we want to cut through red tape, and we want to say that we want results, well, you accept a bit of risk and a bit of possibility for error in so doing.
And now that the DIA has its own minister and will be its own separate entity, not just a branch of another agency, How do you think this new minister might have to navigate a coordination with, say, the Minister of National Defense and the Minister of Industry when it comes to deciding what is a military purchase versus an economic one or another category?
Well, I think this is where the potential tensions exist, namely, when we look at the proposed legislation, the Minister of DIA obviously has a mandate to follow the defense industrial strategy and economic security considerations and the like. And where there may be points of tension with DD-CAF is when the military requirement is heading in one direction, and the defense and industrial considerations or sovereign capability considerations are going in another direction. And there we have potential for tension. By the same token, it may be that the Minister of Industry has particular ambitions, and we've seen Melanie Joly in particular has been very vocal about this and what she sees as the purpose of the defense procurement. That may not always align very well with the overall plan that the Minister of DIA may have. So we can't eliminate these tensions. They will always be there. That's just part of cabinet government. But this minister is being given considerable authority, and therefore I anticipate that the largest check will be from the Prime Minister.
So building on that, the proposed amendments expand the Defense Production Act to include economic security and national security alongside traditional military defense. In your opinion, what are the implications of treating our national economy as maybe a permanent extension of our national defense? And since the Act gives the government powers to direct industry, what might the implications of applying those defense powers to different sectors that aren't necessarily traditionally defense? What might those be?
Well, I anticipate that it has to be read in light of the NATO 1.5% of GDP dedicated to other areas of national security. So that aligns as well with where NATO is going. As well, when we think of things like critical infrastructure or critical minerals or other things that could be so vital to Canada's defense effort or an allied defense effort, that you would want to see investment and some direction coming from the government in that area. That being said, I personally don't read that as much in the legislation. I think it still is defense focused, and national security is a bit of a secondary consideration that can come in. But my read of the act is still that we're primarily dealing with defense projects here.
For some additional context to frame this discussion, Phil, do you know what kinds of changes or amendments have been made to the Defense Production Act in the past? And how does the proposed DIA Act compare in scale and significance to some earlier modifications?
Well, what I would say is, in terms of the scope of the authority, this looks more like the 1950 version of the Defense Production Act than the later version, or later versions, which gave Public Works and Government Services Canada at the time authority for defense procurement, contracting, and whatnot. So we're reverting back to a model where we did have a minister who was charged not only with mobilizing the national economy in certain cases for defense purposes, but also a significantly empowered minister when it came to making certain decisions for defense. It doesn't go quite as far, I would say, as the earlier DPA of 1950, but it does go quite far.
And again, just for some further context, what would you say the proposed legislative changes to this act say about how Canada interprets the international security environment, and what does it say about the international security environment itself?
Well, a number of commentators and former general officers have been saying we need to start thinking about getting on war footing. The Prime Minister has made it very clear that he sees defense investment as critical, and that he sees that the defense industrial strategy is part of a larger plan to mobilize the Canadian economy, not only for economic stability and sovereignty, but also to prepare for potential conflict. The Act is very much, I would argue, in line with with that mantra, or those two mantras and those two visions, that we are headed for a much more dangerous world, one in which we will need to greatly accelerate and augment our defense expenditures, while at the same time using those defense dollars to greatly enhance the Canadian defense industrial base, and to hopefully use defense industry to bolster our economic prosperity and security.
Phil, one of the sections of the legislation allows the minister, I think, to appoint outside advisors and committees. Does this signal a move towards perhaps more industry-led decision-making? And building on that, how could we prevent conflicts of interest when maybe private sector experts are helping shape multi-billion-dollar tenders?
I did find the minister can bring in outside advisors and advisory boards, and they are remunerated, and the CEO can bring in technical experts and also have them remunerated at a particular salary approved by Treasury Board. This tells me that it goes beyond the defense advisory forum that's being set up, because I did not get the sense that would be a remunerated board. So if we are seeing more specialized external to government experts coming in either as advisors to the minister or part of advisory boards, and they're acting in a part-time governor and council position, that would suggest to me that we are bringing outside expertise from industry, from finance, from the technological sector and whatnot, either to assist the minister and advise the minister, or to assist and help the CEO with more technical aspects of this. Now, the conflict of interest aspects, I think, will be dealt with in usual ways. We do have laws in place when it comes to this, and we do have considerations. And if my read of the act is correct, these individuals might be either full-time or part-time public office holders in some cases, certainly the advisory board ones at the ministerial level, and therefore we will kind of deal with the conflict of interest problems. I think where it becomes a little bit more difficult is if there is a perception that these advisors are maybe leaning more in one direction in terms of past work experience, or if they have connections and networks in other areas. That will be obviously an issue to work out, but we've dealt with that in the past. It's just a question of being mindful of it as we move ahead.
You mentioned this earlier as well, but under the proposed amendments to the Act, there's a new exception that would allow the minister to bypass competitive procurement when a defense capability is interoperable or interchangeable with systems used by Canada or allied countries, including NATO members. What does this expanded interoperability and interchangeability exception change maybe about how Canada can select defense suppliers, and how broad could its use be in justifying maybe sole source procurement decisions?
I personally think that this is the broadest of the exceptions that have been given to the minister, simply because not only are you able to effectively say any capability within the Canadian Armed Forces that is interoperable with another one that's available, I could bypass a competitive process. And similarly, any interchangeable one. So just imagine any, I'll give two examples. If you were to use it, for instance, to say, well, the airframe for the P-8 is fundamentally interchangeable with the airframe for the E-7. Therefore, I can justify the E-7 for my AWC. Conversely, the replacement for the Challenger is based on the Bombardier platform. Therefore, perhaps I could justify an interchangeable buy of a Bombardier-based AWC. There are so many different ways in which this exception could be used to get around normal procurement processes. I think it's quite significant. And similar, as you noted, just the number of countries that are listed where, provided that we have interoperability or interchangeability with some of their capabilities, is vast. It's basically every ally that we have on the planet, and even Cabinet can then go on and name additional countries where this would apply. So it will basically allow the Minister of DIA, I would argue, to ensure that the Canadian Forces can get pretty much any particular foreign kit that they'd like, and can really align particular procurements to maximize interchangeability within the Canadian Armed Forces.
Related to this, the DIS sets a goal, I think, for 70% of acquisitions to go to Canadian firms. Does the Canadian industry actually have the capacity to scale up that quickly, or could this maybe create challenges or backlogs?
Well, the DIS lays that out within a particular time frame. So I think we could get there in certain areas. And again, I think it depends on what qualifies as a Canadian firm. I think that's very ambitious, to be quite honest. But it really depends on what the Canadian Armed Forces also chooses to acquire. And this is the other conversation that we're going to end up having is what kind of capability investments are we looking at in the future in light of Ukraine, in light of Iran, in light of all the different threats that we anticipate. The age of disproportionately spending your defense acquisition or defense capital budget on very expensive, large, highly complex multi-year platforms may not be over by any means, but it may be slowing. That may not be the core part of all the capital acquisition or major price of capital acquisition going in the future. So there does leave quite a bit of room for Canadian industry, but it's still very ambitious in order to reach that target. These powers, though, would certainly help the government of Canada achieve that.
Canada obviously reached 2% of NATO defense spending earlier in the year. Are these DPA amendments maybe the engine needed to keep that momentum towards that new 5% target by 2035?
I think the DPA authorities are needed to get there, absolutely. But to your earlier question, it's not entirely clear to me whether or not we have the capacity to spend that amount in that amount of time within Canada, within the targets that the government has spent or set. All that said, the authorities being provided by the DIA legislation, however, would certainly allow us to reach 3.5% of core defense spending through a whole slew of measures that are now available or will be available once the act gets royal assent to the minister. So it is certainly enabling the government of Canada through this new ministerial position and through this new agency to significantly increase research and development, investment in the Canadian defense industrial base, and more accelerated procurement timelines for a number of acquisitions and capabilities.
My last question, Phil, before I turn it back to you for some final thoughts. Even with these legislative and structural changes being targeted or put in place, how realistic is it, do you think, that Canada can fundamentally change its long-standing culture of defense procurement, especially given our proclivities towards caution, risk aversion, and reliance on, I guess, bureaucracy?
Well, this is where I look forward to seeing how the legislation, or whether or not the interpretation that I have of the legislation is correct when it comes to the relationship between DIA and the Treasury Board becomes more defined. One could argue that a good deal of the risk aversion that exists largely resides within TBS and the board. It's not exclusively there, but if DIA has a very outcomes-focused mindset and is willing to take risks and does not always have to meet as much resistance from the board and from TBS as might have existed in the past, then the risk aversion may be less of a factor. Now, again, I anticipate that Treasury Board is not going to be entirely out of this picture. I think they're still going to be there for some fairly large items, and the same with Cabinet. But my sense of this legislation and of what the Prime Minister is trying to do is really to make formal changes organizationally in terms of machinery of government, in terms of authorities, in order to at least enable a very different culture and a very different mindset in terms of what you can do with defense procurement and how quickly you can move and how much should be invested in the Canadian defense industrial base through that as well.
I'm wondering if you might be able to unpack for us what exactly the Defense Investment Agency is being set up to do, and how potential
proposed amendments to the Defense Production Act ties in, and what we think maybe the implications might be for our procurement system and the DIA.
Okay. I think I'd start just by reflecting back on the past year. And I have to give credit to the people who've done the work to get the DIA, the Defense Investment Agency, to the point that they're at now to be looking at legislation. As we all know, there was a lot of work underway at the time that the conversation started about the DIA. A lot of program already underway, and despite the magnitude of the changes of the machinery here, they seem to have kept a lot of big procurements on track, and we're still seeing good progress made. And I think it was an appropriate way of doing it. These big changes to organizations, there's a whole human side to it, a lot of process side to it, and these sorts of things. And they seem to have gotten to a good point, and it's only been a year to make this big a change. So hats off to them. And it really looks like it's not the culmination, but a major step forward in putting in place some of the levers from a Defense Procurement Act perspective, and some of the organizational changes required to achieve these strategic outcomes that the government is trying to achieve, policy outcomes, the defense industrial strategy, national defense policy, some really consequential objectives in the national interest. And the changes are bringing more of a focus. These organizational changes with the DIA Act are really putting a focus on defense procurement and making changes that are required to enable these outcomes to be achieved in the current context, current geopolitical context, the current technological context, the pace of technology change and obsolescence. How we had been doing things in the past was just not keeping up. And I think we're still some questions on exactly how this is going to play out, and a lot more depth is going to have to go into it. But I think it puts us in a good position.
Well, thanks for that, Troy. Given that procurement has been kind of a joint endeavor between a few different government departments, how might this more centralized model under the DIA play out? And I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on potential trade-offs for moving from that larger system to one of more consolidated authority.
So there's certainly more authority here, and we can talk some more about that. I would say my read of it is that other ministers are going to, and in fact it states that ministers that have their own legislative responsibilities, authorities, accountabilities, are going to maintain those. For example, the Minister of National Defense under the National Defense Act and under the Aeronautics Act. The Minister of ISED has roles to play. So those are going to continue to interweave with the work that the DIA is going to do. So some of that's around the pre-procurement before we're really into the acquisition and contracting and contract management side of things. And pre-procurement, the focus being on requirements. And even then, once the contract's in place, we all know when you're managing a big project, those who've been involved in it, there's the iron triangle, the inevitable trade-offs between capability, cost, and schedule. So the requirements conversation doesn't end at the point that a contract is signed or that the requirements are turned over to the procurement agency. That has to continue. That conversation and collaboration has to continue right through to delivery. Certainly appears there's going to be more autonomy for the minister of the DIA from Treasury Board, that some of the foundational contracting authorities are going to be passed on to the Minister DIA. But even there, will be interesting to watch how this plays out. National Defense, under its current delegated contracting authority, signs somewhere in the order of 120 to 130,000 contracts a year, or there are that many contractual activities down to about the $10,000 level. And the DIA, now taking over for PSPC, has much higher dollar value work to do, and clearly the more complex procurements, but would probably be overwhelmed if it tried to take all of the contracting on, so all of the procurement. And it may be then using the same processes and approaches for relatively straightforward things that can be done quickly that it would need to be using for some of these really large major capital projects. So where that cutoff exists, because the Minister of DIA, as the Minister of PSPC can assign some of these authorities down to other organizations, has an oversight role, but there'll still be a split. And then some of the changes are also going to change the nature of the advice and how the governance works, I would imagine. And it could become a bit of a noisy environment for everybody involved for a while until we get to clarity, and there'll be quite a bit of lobbying, I suspect, given the number of sole source exceptions that are now out there. So a lot to change yet. I think the number one thing I would say is having a single minister responsible for the DIA means that every day a minister of cabinet is getting up with a clear focus on this mandate, and that's a powerful thing to have.
Troy, were you still in your ADM role? How do you think maybe that the creation of the Defense Investment Agency might change, if at all, your day-to-day operations and your involvement on the delivery of major projects?
I think for the positive in some ways, for sure, in that the minister, the DIA's focus on efficiency, which is one of the areas that's mentioned in the document, efficiency of national defense or national security procurement, means that we may see a change in how contracting is done. We may see a change or a shift away from the classic contract A, contract B, RFP approach that we've used for the past number of years to more negotiated RFPs. That opens up a different way of doing business. An increased focus on schedule, which will be welcome, and potentially an increased accountability for contract performance when we have a Minister of DIA focused on the procurement files that way. The Materiel group doesn't write the operational requirements for the military. That's clearly Canadian Armed Forces' responsibility. It does have a role to play in ensuring that the logistics support and the engineering support is available as part of that capability requirement in order to be able to deliver and deploy a relevant operational capability. The Materiel group does play in a requirement space in a sense, and again would be part of the definition of the requirement, and then some of those discussions around trade-offs along the way. But in some ways, the Materiel group is also a client of the procurement process, because once everything is delivered, then they continue to sustain that military capability.
In one of the new sections of the proposed legislation, it would allow feasibly for the appointment of outside advisors. What gaps might they fill, and how might they best be involved from your perspective?
I think the outside advice is important. The government no one organization has all of the subject matter expertise. And I would imagine some of these advisors would be able to bring quite a bit of business acumen to the operation, whether that's focus on corporate risk management, finance, their own experience with complex contract negotiations, major projects delivery. There's a lot to be offered there. If you go back in history and we think about the C.D. Howe period, and there was an executive committee that was put in place, and it played an important role in bringing that industry expertise to bear. I think it offers a lot. Of course, that then needs to be married up with the responsibilities of government departments and officials to provide their nonpartisan advice on what needs to be done and how it should be done, whether that's at ISED or the Department of Finance or DND or what have you. So that all needs to be married up too. But it could be very influential. And if we think of the link here, of course, underpinning this is the defense industrial strategy, which almost is a through line for the conversation. As Canadian Armed Forces needs change over the decades, the defense industrial base will be the way to deliver whatever that is when the time comes as needed. The defense industrial base and the defense industrial strategy to put that base in place and make it what it needs to be is the through line that continues to enable delivery of CAF capabilities and also realize the economic benefits that we're seeking.
So we have the defense industrial strategy. We are creating the defense investment agency as its own central agency with its own minister. And we have the new proposed legislation. Sometimes there's been accusations of risk aversion or procedural caution within the bureaucracy generally. Do you think that legislation and creations of new agencies is enough to perhaps address what's been called risk aversion or caution and maybe change the culture more broadly?
I think it will have a very positive impact, and for a number of reasons. One, the proposed legislation makes, for instance, explicit the exceptions that are available in formulating a procurement strategy. So under the government contract regulations, right now there's an exception that's basically a national interest exception that says that the nature of the procurement is such that it doesn't make sense to run a competitive process. It's quite vague. Now that national interest is really made more transparent and clear in the list of exceptions that are in the proposed legislation. So I think that clarity is a way of retiring some risk. Fewer gates if there's more contracting authority in the hands of the Minister of DIA. There's risk-based contracting authority already. It's been around since about 2018, and there's dollar value contracting limits, but I think there may be fewer approval gates to Treasury Board, at least for contracting authority. I'm not as clear about how it might impact the Minister of National Defense's requirements to seek expenditure authorities. An analogy I use, Josh, is imagine you're standing at the end of an arena and you're looking down the ice and someone has laid out orange cones, pylons all across the ice, and they tell you your responsibility is to get from where you are to the other end as quickly as you possibly can. The pylons are basically the rules, and you can either focus on the pylons or you can focus on the white space between the pylons in deciding how you're going to get from one end of the ice to the other. Reducing the number of pylons on the ice, taking some of the rules away, moving some of these barriers out of the way is clearly going to make your task that much easier. And then there's also an element of finding new ways of getting from one end to the other. And a quick anecdote for you. I remember a few years ago having a conversation with Ellen Lord. She was the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment in the Pentagon. Exceptional individual. She'd also been the CEO of Textron. And I asked her one day, how, given her experience, would she characterize innovation in government? And she paused and she came up with a brilliant answer. She said, creative compliance. there's always going to be compliance to the rules. So to the extent that you can move the rules out of the way, reduce process steps that have to be completed, boxes that have to be checked or whatever, you're allowing people then to see more of that white space to find innovative ways to get things done. And that may bring a requirement for new skill sets, different ways for, I don't know, the Canadian Armed Forces to look at its relationship with research and development, applied research and development, the DIA for how we conduct complex contract negotiations, ISED for how it interacts with industry to ensure the defense industrial strategy outcomes for ITBs, how ITBs, the renewed ITB process, can be applied to achieve those outcomes. So I think these changes are really going to open up some open ice for the players who are in the arena.
You can't have a Canadian defense podcast without at least one hockey reference or ice reference, Troy. Thanks for a great discussion. We've covered the DIA, the new legislation, the Defense Production Act. I just want to turn it back to you once more and ask if you have any final thoughts, predictions you'd like to share with our audience, some of whom are a lay and general audience, about these developments before we wrap up today.
I think there's going to be a period of time where people are coming to understand some of the language that's in the proposed legislation. It makes very clear that the powers of the minister of the DIA will include now goods and services, acquisition of goods and services for national defense or national security. What's the distinction? There's also references in the document to economic security and public safety. And what are the boundaries around that? How does it matter in this context? Interoperability and interchangeability. There are NATO definitions for those, but they appear in the list of exceptions to competition. That will mean something to people. Do they really understand what it means? And the minister will have quite a bit of discretion, because the decision to apply these exceptions comes down to the minister's opinion. So does everybody really understand what these terms mean and the implications of the terms?
And that is all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.